Well, here we are. The people who are likely to be in charge of public health for the next 4 years are people who said a lot of questionable things during the COVID pandemic. And this video is going to serve as a record of those questionable things. Well, some of them. There's too many to include in one video. But if you want to see more of what we're going to talk about here today, I highly recommend you check out We Want Them Infected by Dr. Jonathan Howard. Dr. Jonathan Howard is an associate professor of neurology and psychiatry at NYU and the chief of neurology at Bellevue Hospital. And I have him with me today to go through a collection of videos that he has compiled, just showcasing what these people said during the pandemic, how things turned out, and whether or not they have a good track record in predicting what's going to happen with COVID and at proposing good ideas to deal with it. So without further ado, let's get to the video. All right, so here I am with Dr. Jonathan Howard, and we have all these videos queued up for you all to see. So again, these are people who want to and very well may be in power when it comes to public health, and we want to see their track record. We want to see, have they been right during one of the most trying public health times in recent history, and will they continue that pattern into a future of public health, should they be in power? So Dr. Jonathan Howard, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Dan. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too. All right, so we got this first video here. Do you want to just preface this video with anything, or should we get right into it?
No, I think it's worthwhile to preface this video to say that we're going to be hearing Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is a Stanford health economist, who is the nominee to run the NIH. And this video is from the beginning of the pandemic, April, I think, 2020. And to hear Dr. Jay Bhattacharya speak about his pandemic record now, he was motivated only by concerns for the education of poor children and the working class and the vulnerable. But here's what he was worried about in April 2020. Okay. Let's take a listen.
All right, April 2020, Jay Bhattacharya's words.
Studies. Take a very close look at the resources of the hospital resources available and ask, if I lift the caps, will I really stress the hospital systems or not? We could follow the same structure of the policy we're following, except now with real numbers. It could be that many places around the country, including California, it's safe to lift the caps. So the next step to me is run the studies everywhere, redo the models, and take a hard look and ask, is it really worth it to suppress the economy if I'm not going to stress the hospital systems and have COVID-19 patients die as a result of it?
Jay, do you?
So there we go. Is it worth it to suppress the economy? Now, just a little caveat that I want to make clear. I was protected from economic worry during the pandemic. I was very blessed. I was very lucky. And I don't want to minimize the stress of small business owners and people who worried about their incomes. But it's just important to remember that in April 2020, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya wasn't worried about poor children in schools. He was worried about the economy. That was his motivation at the time.
Yeah, a lot of people were spared the economic hard times of the pandemic, and so yeah, we don't want to minimize that. It was tough for a lot of people, but what I always like to stress is a big reason of why it was tough is because it was so mismanaged, right? We didn't have to really lock down for as long as we did. We maybe should have had a more unified response with more sustainable solutions rather than just a blunt months-long lockdown period. But suggesting that if we just let everything go, then the economy would be better is not correct, because as you know, having worked in a hospital, when hospital systems get stressed, it affects everything.
Right. It's not like people would have been going out to restaurants and bars and movie theaters as their elderly neighbors and relatives were being moved with forklifts into refrigerated trucks because our morgues were overflowing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I wanted to show that video because it really shows that in April 2020, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya was concerned about the economy, about businesses, about keeping American enterprise flowing and uninterrupted.
Important to know that, I think.
Yeah.
So this next video is from, again, November of 2020, and it's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya talking about his prediction, I guess, or his assessment that COVID is much less deadly for people under 70. So why did you pick this video?
Well, because a few things. So COVID's risk to young people was not a secret at the start of the pandemic. There were articles in the Washington Post from either April or March 2020, essentially saying that hundreds of young people had already died of COVID, including some healthy young people. Ask anyone who worked in the hospital at the time. We saw some young people die of COVID for sure. And in 2021, COVID, immediately after this video was made, even with effective vaccines, COVID became a top 10 killer for every age group, I think, except for maybe babies. And here, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is saying that COVID is not nearly as deadly for people under age 70. As if we heard of a 65-year-old dying of COVID, we would say, oh my gosh, that's unusual. I can't believe that. And of course, death is not COVID's only bad outcome. So let's take a listen.
Yep, let's hear it.
A second premise is that I think everyone will agree that this is an absolutely deadly disease for people who are older and for people who have certain chronic conditions. Right. The infection survival rate from seroprevalence data, now 50 some high quality seroprevalence studies, says that there's a 95% survival rate for people who are 70 and older. For people under 70, it's 99.95% survival. It's much less deadly for people who are under 70, 99.95.
Well, so he's essentially saying that people under 70 have 99.95% chance of surviving COVID. And what is often missed, the mistake here is, number one, using seroprevalence studies, which are not always accurate. They are not always a good capture of how many people actually got infected. And it's also not a good indicator of how many people did not make it, right? Seroprevalence studies do not capture how many people did not survive a disease. And then it also ignores the hard number that at the end of the pandemic, around 2024, where we have data, about 1 million Americans had died from this illness, which is not trivial, and that is not captured by this throwing out these stats of 99 point however many numbers you want to put after that surviving under the age of 70. It does not capture that suffering, that loss.
And keep in mind, he was saying this at a time when no one was vaccinated. So he was telling 60-year-olds, 65-year-olds that your risk of COVID is minimal. And he was discounting all of COVID's non-fatal harms. And as we listen to these videos, and as you read anything by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya from the first, basically any time throughout the pandemic, it's always useful to think about it with this in mind, that no one who worked on a COVID unit would say such a thing. So Dr. Bhattacharya, I'm very familiar with this office background because that's where he spent most of the pandemic, giving interviews from his office about what he would have done. He would have opened schools. He would have kept businesses open, when in fact, all he did was just give interviews saying what he would have done. All right. So this video is from the signing of the Great Barrington Declaration, and we're going to hear a clip later on about what the Great Barrington Declaration was all about. Just a little bit of a preview. A lot of people now like to claim that the Great Barrington Declaration was only about keeping poor children in school and this sort of thing and keeping businesses open, when in reality it advocated herd immunity via mass infection. And part of this, and we heard this in the last video too, was just trying to numb people to COVID's risk. And as you can see here, the signing of the Great Barrington Declaration was a highly produced affair. So this person who we're seeing right now is a journalist by the name of David Zweig. I think I'm pronouncing his name right, but journalists were invited. There was a camera crew invited. Very unusual for a gathering of epidemiologists and doctors. And the journalist is going to ask Dr. Bhattacharya about the risk of death to a 40-year-old teacher, and you will hear his answer, as well as him just casually brushing off all of COVID's non-fatal harms.
All right.
Frightened. How dare you tell me to risk my life or I could die going to a classroom?
We know that 40-year-old teacher from the seroprevalence studies, other work, that they face a very moderate risk should they become infected of dying. Somewhere on the order of 2 in 1,000. 998 of those 40-year-olds will survive should they become infected out of 1,000.
And without serious long-term health effects.
Every virus, the flu can have some long-term effects, but the fraction of the population to get those is small. But it's not 100 out of the 1,000 will have those long-term effects. It's likely to be much smaller from the evidence that I've seen.
So there we go. A risk of death of 1 in 500. He was talking about 40-year-olds there. I think there's a little error in the auto translation where it says 4-year-olds, but he's talking about 40-year-old teachers. And he says a risk of death of 1 in 500 is very moderate. Imagine that every 40-year-old in the country tomorrow had to eat from a jar of jelly beans, 500 jelly beans, and one of them was poisonous and would kill you. Would you sleep well knowing you were going to eat from that jar tomorrow, Dan?
I would not want to even take that chance. I would want to completely avoid jelly beans if I had the option to, and I would definitely want to avoid poisonous jelly beans.
Right. So just keep in mind a 1 in 500 risk of death is very moderate. And one thing that I observed over the pandemic is that doctors treated vaccine side effects as a fate worse than death. And we're going to hear Dr. Bhattacharya doing that now.
We should not be reorganizing our societies around the prevention of COVID. That is a huge mistake, as we've seen the last 3.5 years.
Well, Dr. Bhattacharya, the idea of requiring students to have an experimental shot that does not prevent COVID transmission and it does not prevent you from getting COVID, how does that make any sense at any school or in any workplace?
Laura, it never made any sense, especially since the risk of dying or severe disease from COVID for young people is very, very, very low. It would never make sense to mandate the vaccine for them, especially since young men seem to have myocarditis from the vaccine at relatively high rates. It should have just been an option. To require it is just it's contrary to the basic principles of science.
Based on this December 2021 study, pre-COVID, there was an estimated 1 to 10 cases of myocarditis per 100,000 people every year. Vaccine-related myocarditis has been reported in up to 5 cases per 100,000 people. So it appears a vaccine may elevate myocarditis risk slightly, but the rate of direct COVID-associated myocarditis is estimated to be 1,000 to 1,400 per 100,000 people. So the risk of getting myocarditis from catching COVID-19 is actually hundreds of times higher than the risk from vaccines.
Yep. Do we want to keep watching or?
No, I think that's good enough.
Okay.
And we don't want to minimize this vaccine side effect, I don't think. But people who have reported on it have universally said that it's mild, meaning that people who get it recover almost always within a couple of days. But he's speaking about it here with much more sort of gravity than he spoke about the 1 in 500 risk of death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so he's saying something here that a lot of people who don't like vaccines tend to repeat, which is, how does it make any sense to mandate COVID vaccines when it doesn't prevent transmission or from you catching it? And the answer there is multiple. there are multiple answers there. One is that it does reduce your risk of transmission. It can give you an immune memory that can kick in and reduce the length of time you are shedding infectious virus, because your immune memory is able to clear the virus faster than if you hadn't had the vaccine in the first place. Second of all, it's really useful in a population for public health for as few people as possible to get sick, especially during a pandemic. Because like we talked about earlier, if a lot of people get sick all at the same time, it stresses the hospital systems. And when the hospital systems get stressed, if you suddenly have an emergency and you need to go to the emergency room and it's, say, a heart attack, or you have appendicitis or something like that, you need treatment pretty quickly. But if the hospital is so burnt out from treating COVID patients constantly, if there aren't enough staff, if there aren't enough beds, then you might not receive care in time, and you might end up getting seriously hurt by something that otherwise would have been a routine surgery like appendicitis. That's pretty serious. And at a time when COVID vaccines were mandated, there were, it got up to what, like a couple thousand people dying every week from COVID, or every day from COVID. That's huge.
Well, at the peak in January 2021, this was right after vaccines came out, 3,000 people were dying per day.
Yeah.
Almost 100,000 Americans had died in January 2021 alone. And I never argued for vaccine mandates. I never argued against them either. But the best way to avoid people having to take a vaccine against their will is to honestly convince them that getting the vaccine is in their best interest. Mm-hmm. So imagine if all of these doctors, instead of standing up for the rights of anti-vaxxers to refuse vaccines, leading to the death of many thousands of people who would still be alive, imagine if they had directed that energy to convincing people to take the vaccine, which, to be fair, Dr. Bhattacharya did, at least for older people. But when it came to young people, however you define that, it appears he defined that as people less than 70. He wrote articles titled "The Ill-Advised Push to Vaccinate the Young," and was very much against vaccinating young people. So imagine if he had redirected his energies towards convincing people to take the vaccine, and therefore the mandates wouldn't have been necessary in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Mandates are not ideal because it does create a lot of pushback, a lot of resistance, because a lot of people don't like being mandated to do things. And there's something to be said about that. And especially in the information age of the internet, where a lot of commentators are going to latch onto that mandate and use that as a reason to spread a lot of other things that aren't true about vaccines. Mandates are not ideal. But when you have 3,000 people dying every single day of a disease, you have to do something. You have to control the disease. And since we did not have a unified response, and because the virus was running wild essentially in America, we had to do something. And so I think that's the logic behind mandates, whether you like it or not. And getting vaccinated did save millions of lives. So.
Yeah, and someone losing their job from a vaccine mandate is not a good thing. I don't want to trivialize that, but they are better off than someone who lost their job because they died.
Yeah.
And the rationale for vaccine mandates, as you suggested, doesn't just depend on the vaccine's ability to stop transmission. It also depends on hospital systems, this sort of thing. But the more effective a vaccine is at stopping transmission, the more rationale there is to mandate that. And we're going to be hearing a clip of Dr. Bhattacharya discussing the vaccine's ability to block transmission. Not in this one, but coming up.
Okay. Did we? I don't think we did this one.
Okay, let's take a look.
Oh, he's comparing flu deaths. So
this is from November 2020. And by this point in the pandemic, so the first COVID death, I think, was at the very end of February 28th, 2020, at least here in the United States. So starting at that point, COVID killed around 123 or 133 children by November 2020. And during that same time frame, COVID killed 9. Excuse me, the flu killed 9. So let's take a listen to what Dr. Bhattacharya has to say about which virus is more dangerous.
And for children, it's frankly the flu is worse. We've had more flu deaths among children than this year than COVID deaths, just in terms of mortality.
Yeah, so that's not true.
It's not true. And the next year, in the 2020-2021 flu season, a single child died of the flu. So mitigation measures that dented COVID obliterated the flu, and I think a flu strain was eliminated from the earth, like the Yamagata B flu strain or something like that.
Yeah, apparently it is, yeah.
And so during the same time that COVID killed 1,000 children, the flu killed 1, but here is Dr. Bhattacharya saying the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And when it comes to vaccinating children, at least, it doesn't really matter, right? My children are vaccinated against the flu and COVID. It's not like we have to pick one of the two. But at least during the first 4 years of the pandemic, maybe not today in 2025, but COVID was much deadlier for children than the flu, and hospitalized thousands, 234,000 children were hospitalized with COVID in the first 4 years of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, just recently on this channel, I talked to Dr. Paul Offit, and he's a pediatrician, and he described his experience treating children who were struggling to breathe of COVID. These are babies. And so we just look at the numbers, and we know that COVID killed more children than every vaccine preventable disease that you can name. And that's a huge deal. And that's, again, just looking at deaths, not just how many children had to go to the hospital, how many children ended up with multisystem inflammatory syndrome, how many children had to go to the ICU, or how many children even lost parents or grandparents to COVID. All of those things are very, very traumatic for a child, and also very stressful for parents. Taking a child to a hospital sucks. It's super expensive. It's not fun for anybody, and it's really stressful.
Yeah, and I think we have to be humble about the potential consequences of 10 COVID infections by the time a child turns 20, for example. And I'll also say that all of the numbers that we are giving now reflect what actually did happen. And we did take a lot of efforts to mitigate COVID in 2020 and maybe the first half of 2020-21. But what would have happened had we listened to these guys and allowed 73 million American children, none of whom who were vaccinated at the time, to simultaneously contract COVID in 2020, which, as you will hear, is what they proposed. What would have happened then? Pediatric hospitals would have been totally overwhelmed and deluged, and we know that because that did happen during the Delta wave. That did happen during the Omicron wave, and it would have been much worse had it ripped through the pediatric population with none of them vaccinated.
Yeah, all of those things that did happen that you just mentioned were with the, fragmented response that the U.S. did have, but it was a response. There, people were wearing masks. Certain states were having different restrictions, but the Great Barrington Declaration, supported by Bhattacharya and the people here, would have had really none of that. It would have just protected the vulnerable somehow.
Somehow. They claim they would have protected the vulnerable.
Yeah. Let's just put all the vulnerable people somewhere while everybody around them gets infected. That's a great plan.
What could go wrong?
Yeah. Okay, so this...
All right, so this clip is from the signing of the Great Barrington Declaration, And we are going to be hearing Dr. Sunitra Gupta, an epidemiologist from Oxford, who predicted, or not even predicted, said that a lot of parts of the world, or several parts of the world, had reached herd immunity, I think as early as the spring of 2020. Anyways, they're going to be talking about COVID reinfections as this very sort of rare kind of thing, as this zebra, 1 in a million.
All right.
But, so we might get these sort of epidemics, but there are two issues here. One is that the people who will be exposed to the virus in the new epidemic will be the newborns, who will be exposed for the first time, and for them the risk is probably not terribly high from what we're seeing. And for those of us who might be re-exposed, again, it's likely, from looking at the other coronaviruses, that reinfection will not carry the same risk of severe disease and death. And that's also true for many other pathogens, that the second exposure does not carry the same risks.
I think in the early days of the coronavirus, this novel coronavirus epidemic, there was some worry about whether immunity actually was generated by infection. It sounds like that's not so much of a worry, but we've seen immunity in the context of infections with SARS-CoV-2. Is that true?
Yeah, I would certainly say so.
How many reinfections have there been to date?
Well, I mean, even if we had seen 1 or 2 reinfections, I mean, we know that people get reinfected with chickenpox. We don't immediately abandon the idea that you get lifelong immunity to chickenpox or measles or anything from the few incidents.
But we're talking about a very small number.
Very small number of reinfections do not indicate anything about the actual distribution of.
So in that sense, when we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, it fits into the picture of natural history, the typical viruses you've described. It's not a virus from Mars. It's a virus that, in that sense, we can set expectations from the modeling and the kind of analysis you'd expected. Eventually, it will go down, even without a vaccine. It will go down.
Oh yes, I think so. But I think it's not, probably immunity is not lifelong if we go by the other coronaviruses, but it's long enough that it will result in this endemic state where the number of people infected at any point in time might be a bit higher than measles, but the effects on people, the actual death toll, will be very low.
Things didn't turn out exactly that way. We have never reached herd immunity to a virus without an effective vaccine because babies aren't born with natural immunity. We now know that COVID reinfections are trivially common. They are not all benign. There was a study from the NIH, I think it was from the NIH, doesn't really matter, but it said that COVID reinfections often have the same severity as the first infection. You may be tempted to think that they were correct because we are no longer seeing hospitals overwhelmed with COVID patients, for example. But the reason for that is twofold. Number one, the vaccines. And number two is something called mortality displacement, which just essentially means that people can only die once. So 1.2 million Americans who were by definition vulnerable to COVID are no longer here for the virus to kill a second time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think she also said at that point something along the lines of newborns will be exposed to the virus and their risk is not that high. That's not true. Newborns have the highest risk of all children. I think it's comparable to a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old, something like that, of grave outcomes. So that was just another piece of misinformation there as well. But the idea that they were treating this coronavirus infection like chickenpox, like measles, which are viruses that you can only get once in your life, well, that didn't turn out so well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so the idea of trying to say like, oh, this is how other coronaviruses behave, so we should expect this one to behave the same way. It's not a terrible way to approach COVID, but it also, you can't bet on viruses like that. Viruses are very unpredictable. One influenza virus is going to behave very differently from another influenza virus. So you can't just look at history and say, this is what we should do public health wise. And yeah, getting reinfected with COVID is not always trivial. Obviously, from one infection, you probably have some form of immune memory that's going to protect you from severe disease should you get reinfected. But there are many people who have suffered serious consequences or even died from their second or third infection. So, yeah, I mean, this is just another kind of example of them, I guess, in my view, trivializing something that did turn out to be more serious than what they're making it out to be.
And keep in mind, when they made that video, the virus was less than a year old, or at least had been known about for less than a year.
Mm-hmm.
And here they were talking about it like chickenpox and measles, viruses that had existed and we've known about for as long as medicine has been a thing. They were treating it as this very familiar, predictable thing. And things didn't turn out that way. But as we will hear in this little clip, that didn't stop Dr. Bhattacharya from spiking the football and claiming that he was right the whole time.
Oh.
So this clip is from May 2021, and he actually is going to be two things about this. He's going to be wrong, but he's going to define herd immunity in actually a reasonable way. There's another clip that we're not going to say, where we're not going to show, but Dr. Bhattacharya redefined or tried to redefine herd immunity by essentially saying people aren't getting as sick anymore, which again is not the definition of herd immunity. That, as I've said, is something called mortality displacement. But here he's going to say that basically we are at herd immunity, and he's going to say that COVID is a seasonal virus. And just so everyone can remember exactly what was happening in May 2021, this was a very optimistic time. I think there were about 10,000 COVID cases in the whole country at this time. Vaccines were being rolled out. We all thought that they were close to perfect. So it was a very optimistic time. But the Delta variant was ravaging India, and it was 2 months away from doing the same to the United States.
So this is just before Delta hits the United States.
Herd immunity means the disease isn't spreading at high rates. Doesn't mean the disease is gone.
Right.
In that sense, we're kind of already there. The disease has mostly stopped spreading in the U.S. Now, it may come back because this is very clearly a seasonal disease. It's like the other coronaviruses is seasonal. It's not surprising this is seasonal. So it may come back. But as long as our older population, the vulnerable, are protected, we no longer will have to panic about it.
Well, that didn't happen. Yeah. So, he calls it seasonal there. That's also, it also is not seasonal because, as we know, Delta spiked in the summer, June, July, I think, in the US. And it was one of the deadlier waves of COVID that the US experienced.
Especially in places where Dr. Jay Bhattacharya helped run the show, like Florida. And what did Dr. Bhattacharya say about the Delta variant? He said, I don't think the Delta variant changes the calculus in any fundamental way. He told Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, we have protected the vulnerable by vaccinating the older population. He said that at the end of July 2021, not even weeks, days after that, COVID started ripping through Florida, causing record deaths, record hospitalizations in both people he called vulnerable and people he called not vulnerable. Something like 24 children, I think, died in Florida during the Delta wave.
Yeah, it seems to be a pattern to me of saying, oh, don't worry about that. Oh, don't worry about that. Oh, don't worry about that. And then things keep happening that we should probably have prevented if we worried about it a little bit.
And then when the Omicron variant arrived, he told people not to panic about that either.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the virus did, Dr. Bhattacharya was there to say, don't worry about it. It only affects your great-grandma, and it's all going away anyway. And that leads into this next clip. This is from April 2021 with a formerly respected science communicator, Dr. Zubin Damania, aka Z-Dog. And there's really a couple points to be made from this. So first of all, Dr. Bhattacharya waged a sort of two-front war to try to infect as many not vulnerable people with COVID as possible. Part of this was political, talking to politicians to try to remove mitigation measures. And the second was more directed towards you, me, and probably 90% of people listening to this, to try to get ourselves psychologically used to the idea of COVID infections. And we've heard him do this many times already, talking about the 1 in 500 risk of death is very moderate, and don't worry about COVID's non-fatal harms. And it's much milder for people under 70. And in this clip, again, April 2021, he is going to say a couple of things. One thing that stands out, he's going to say the central problem right now is the fear that some people still have about COVID. Think about this. This was April 2021. The Delta variant was on the horizon. The Omicron variant was on the horizon. And he is saying the central problem is the fear that people still have about COVID. The second part of this video, he and Dr. Damania are going to agree that the chances of two vaccinated people giving each other COVID are zero. So Dr. Bhattacharya would later say the idea that the COVID vaccine stops transmission was a horrible lie. But here he is, I guess, propagating that lie.
Interesting. All right, let's see it.
What is the main concern you have right now, sort of in this whole?
I mean, I think that the central problem right now, I think, is the fear that people still feel about COVID, even after the vaccination effort has been, actually in many ways in the U.S., quite successful. I think that we are so used to this fear that we've lived under for a year that we don't know how to get out of it. So you can see this when people that are vaccinated, they still are wearing them. My mom, okay, she's 80. She got the vaccine. She got the second vaccine. It's been now a month and some since she got the vaccines. And she tells me she's so used to wearing the mask that she wears it inside when there's no one there because she's just used to it. And there's still this fear. How do we decondition that?
Well, and then the question would be, and this is common. Like we're seeing this sort of pall of conditioned fear, and it's taken about a year of conditioning. So now, like walking outside with a mask is like terrifying to a lot of people, even after vaccination. Now, you and I are both vaccinated. Mm-hmm. We shook hands. We don't wear masks. We're about 3 feet apart from each other, and in the early days of the pandemic, that would have gotten us both hung. But now I can say with confidence, because I've looked at the data, like our chances of giving each other COVID are pretty much zero. Yeah. So how do we decondition it? And in the setting of continued uncertainty.
And this is what I meant too when I said, just watch all of these clips with the idea that no doctor who actually treated COVID patients would say such a thing. No one who worked on a COVID unit in April 2021 would say the central problem right now is the fear that people still have about COVID, and we really think we need to work hard to decondition it. But he was successful, and thousands of people ended up dying.
Yeah, he deconditioned people to the point of they just didn't care about COVID at all. Didn't get vaccinated, didn't want to take precautions, and they paid the price one way or another. It's weird here. So the whole vaccine transmission thing is really interesting to me here, because this is something that a lot of anti-vaxxers will harp on endlessly when it comes to COVID. They will complain and just scream about how they were lied to about vaccines stopping transmission, and they'll name certain people. They never name Jay Bhattacharya and Z-Dog here, who are looking at the same data that everyone else is at the time, which did show that if you're vaccinated with COVID, then you're very unlikely to test positive for it, get symptomatic disease, and you're very unlikely to transmit it. We know that was not going to last. And there were several doctors, including Dr. Daniel Griffin over at This Week in Virology, for example, saying that this will not last. The immunity is going to wane as immunity does. The antibody levels are going to wane. And when that happens, the short incubation period of SARS-CoV-2 is going to be faster than your immune memory. Your immune memory is not going to be able to kick in and stop the virus from transmitting altogether. People knew that, but the data at the time showed that at that time, vaccines were good at reducing transmission. And so that's what a lot of public health people said. And now Jay Bhattacharya and Z-Dog there were saying the same thing. So I just want to make the point to the listeners that there was a reason people were saying that in the beginning. It was not just out of nowhere. It wasn't just a lie. It was a misunderstanding of the context and the data. But I mean, there you go. The guy who anti-vaxxers want to run the NIH is repeating the big lie that they're all mad about.
Exactly right. And by the way, that just provided the best rationale for vaccine mandates that exists. If 2 vaccinated people can't transmit the disease, then that's why we needed vaccine mandates at the time. Other people who claimed that the vaccines stopped transmission in the first 6 months of 2021, including the man on the screen right now, Dr. Marty Makary, Dr. Vinay Prasad said that as well, Dr. Monica Gandhi, Dr. Lucy McBride. So all of these doctors claimed that the vaccines stopped transmission. And now they all say that was the pandemic's biggest lie. For the record, I found one tweet of mine on the topic, also from April 2021, where I said something along the lines, I'm very, very, very confident that COVID vaccines will reduce transmission, but I'm not certain of it. Therefore, I still wear a mask when I treat COVID patients or when I'm in the general public. And again, this is them just treating the virus, which at this point was about 1.5 years old, and the vaccines, which were 6 months old, as these totally known things, as they were measles, the MMR, or the polio vaccines, etc. And I tell you what, before we get to Marty Makary, maybe you can just show the one clip that I sent you in the chat. And we'll sort of end there for Dr. Bhattacharya. Because this clip, this is from the signing of the Great Barrington Declaration. And we're going to hear his co-author, Dr. Sumitra Gupta, speak. And this really shows what it was all about. The promise that the mass infection of unvaccinated people under age 60 to 70 would lead to herd immunity in 3 to 6 months. Because there's a lot of revisionist history, as I've already alluded to, that the Great Barrington Declaration was only about poor children in schools and the working class and protecting the vulnerable. But let's just listen to them describe it in their own words and watch Jay Bhattacharya nod along as she proposes the mass infection of unvaccinated youth to reach herd immunity.
All right, let's hear it.
Do you think we should be moving to this kind of regime immediately, no matter what we hear about a vaccine?
Yes, I would agree that we should move towards this regime. Obviously, I hope fervently that we do have a vaccine by spring with which to offer further protection to the vulnerable sectors. But in any event, that we will be relying on a combination of vaccination and naturally acquired immunity to provide the level of protection we really want. The 2 other points I wanted to make was that this business of protecting the vulnerables in some ways is just a subset of total lockdown. And we've certainly endured total lockdown and implemented it. And, you know, some people would certainly say it was successful. So I think that one could view it in that sense as just a subset of what we've already done. And also just to remember that it would be a temporary measure. So I think a lot of the criticism is kind of predicated on it being a kind of permanent state of affairs. And of course, that's not what we're advocating. We're saying, let's just do this for the 3 months that it takes for the pathogen to sweep through the population, create enough herd immunity.
So you think it would be that short a period needed before we could reach herd immunity? I mean, people who advocate on the other side of this will say that we don't know how long immunity lasts for. We don't know if herd immunity would be achievable in that kind of time frame.
Well, I think almost, it's a sort of fundamental feature of a pathogen that has the kind of infectious period that this SARS-CoV-2 has, and the R0 that it has, that it should rise, peak, and drop off within that period. I think almost all mathematical modelers would agree to that. And indeed, that is what we've observed in many countries where it has kind of ripped through. So, I mean, I would be confident in saying that if we adopted this strategy, then maybe we could all have a very nice, normal Christmas.
Dr. Bhattacharya, can I ask you?
All right. So she's saying that adopting the strategy of letting it rip, as she said, as other countries did, would allow them to have a normal Christmas, or us to have a normal Christmas.
Correct.
And
so,
yeah,
when the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration claim, as they do, that they have been vindicated, Dan, do you know of any examples of countries that use focus protection to achieve herd immunity in 3 months?
I can't name one.
Yeah, no, me neither. I know at least one that tried, but just think about this. The idea that the mass infection of these unvaccinated people would lead to the end of the pandemic in 3 to 6 months. This was their fundamental plan. And we can take a slight detour here, and I imagine you do, but do you know the origins of the Great Barrington Declaration?
I don't actually.
So it's interesting. So it was arranged by a man by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who at the time was a part of AIR. I forget exactly what that stands for, American Enterprise Economic Research Institute, something like that. They're headquartered in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And I saw you sort of sigh when I said Jeffrey Tucker's name, because I imagine you know now that he runs the Brownstone Institute. And he is a problematic guy. He is an unapologetic advocate of child labor. He wrote this article in 2016 called Let the Kids Work, which is exactly what it sounds like. And he suggested that closing of public schools, not private schools, and that children should be allowed to work at Walmart and Chick-fil-A. And so when I hear the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration say that they were just about education and they just wanted schools open, and that people like you and me wanted to shut down schools forever and this sort of nonsense, who partnered with an unapologetic advocate of child labor as child labor laws are being rolled back across the United States? Raise your hand if you did not partner with a child labor advocate. Okay, there we go. And if Jay Bhattacharya was ever a guest on this program, he could not raise his hand. And this guy who portrays himself as this massive advocate for education, I've never heard him speak out against Jeffrey Tucker. I have never heard him oppose child labor laws. Raise your hand if you oppose child labor. Okay, so there we go. I have heard him say that lockdowns force children into labor in poor parts of the world, which I don't know if that's true or not. If it is, that's horrible and sad and disgusting. But he's done nothing to oppose child labor here in the United States and is teamed up with overt, unapologetic child labor advocates.
It's fair to look at the company people keep, right? That is fair to do. And also the actions that they take, which he supported this Great Barrington Declaration, which did call for lots of people to get infected to build what they thought was going to be herd immunity.
And I encourage people to actually read the document and read the frequently asked questions section and read all of their articles from 2020, all about natural immunity leading to herd immunity. They have removed the phrases natural immunity and herd immunity from their vocabulary today, but that's all that they talked about in the first year of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think just before we move to Makary, who I think we're going to move to in a minute, it's important to reiterate that this plan to protect the vulnerable that they keep talking about, it might sound reasonable to an average listener, like, oh yeah, let's just protect the people who are most likely going to be affected by this virus. But how do you do that? And who do you forget in trying to implement any kind of plan? So, I mean, for example, we're talking about how he claims to have done this for the poor and the working class. Well, poor children are more likely to live with grandparents. They're more likely to live with people with chronic conditions, because the poor definitely don't have as good of access to healthcare and as good of access to healthier foods and meals. So if you imagine a scenario where you're trying to protect the vulnerable, what are you actually doing with the vulnerable? Are you taking them all and putting them somewhere? Are you what are you telling them to just stay home? Well, if they're just staying home and their kids are going to school and everybody else is getting COVID, the kids are going to bring COVID home to their elderly grandparents or their parents who have chronic conditions. It's not a solution that makes any sense to me. I don't know how they thought it was supposed to work, but I've always tried to ask them that. I mean, I'm off Twitter now, but Jay Bhattacharya had blocked me on Twitter. And I would just ask him, like, what exactly was the plan? How do you account for these children who live in households with elderly or vulnerable people? How do you create a system where people caring for the vulnerable that you're protecting, or bringing them food, or helping them in whatever help they need during their 3 months of isolation, or whatever you have planned? How are they protected from the people around them, helping them, who are going to get COVID in your model? So I just never understood how that was supposed to work.
Yeah, so they made a few claims. Number one, they claimed kids don't transmit COVID. So that's how they got rid of that one problem. Number two, they said things, and you can read this in the frequently asked questions section. They said things like, during times of high transmission, groceries and other essentials should be delivered to vulnerable people, which, as you said, sounds nice. But I kind of liken it to a coach whose game plan is score more points than the other team. It's not wrong. As a matter of fact, it's the perfect plan, but it's not a very good plan. And when his team loses, he can't point the finger at his players and say, I told you exactly what to do. But that's what Dr. Bhattacharya did. He blamed public health officials for failing to carry out the Great Barrington Declaration. And if you look at their plan, again, in the frequently asked questions section, they said, how do you protect older people living at home? And their answer to that was 4 sentences long. And what you're talking about here is one of the greatest logistical challenges in the history of the world, having 200 million people live in a world of pure COVID, and 100 million people or so live in a world of zero COVID. And how do you separate those two? And their answers were sentences long. It was obviously not a well thought out plan, which again is why you couldn't name, and no one can name, a single country that used focused protection to achieve herd immunity in 3 to 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would also liken it to the difference between a boss and a leader, where a boss is saying, go get this done. And that's it. And whereas a leader is going to actually facilitate the process and lead through the steps needed to complete a task. And it sounds like Jay Bhattacharya wanted to be a boss and say, this is what we have to do. I don't know how you do it. I don't care how you do it. Just get it done.
And I'll say the one positive of him and Makary seizing power is now that the roles are reversed. They are in charge. They are going to be responsible for everything that happens. And we have the right as American citizens to make these demands of them and say, you have to get this done. And if you don't do it, it's your fault. You failed.
Yeah.
They are the medical establishment now.
Mm-hmm. And we'll see.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Marty Makary. Or do you want to give a preface to this video?
Yeah, so Dr. Makary is a pancreatic surgeon at Johns Hopkins University. And he was known before the pandemic for the originator of one of the most dangerous medical myths, the idea that medical error is the third leading cause of death. And this is one of those statistics, like if you just run the numbers, it doesn't make any sense, because it would imply that over half of people who died in the hospital died because of a medical error, which is not the case as someone who has worked in a hospital and seen people die there. And Marty Makary was reasonable the first year or so of the pandemic. But then starting in December 2020, I won't be showing you these clips, but he said that we only need to vaccinate about 20% of Americans to get to herd immunity. And one reason he said that is he was such a huge fan of natural immunity. He wrote these articles called The Power of Natural Immunity, and he just glorified it, said it was this wonderful thing. He wrote an article in the Washington Post, "Natural immunity is powerful. Policymakers are afraid to say so." And we agree that natural immunity is powerful, namely that it killed 1.2 million Americans and injured millions more. And in this clip, from right when the Delta wave was gearing up, you are going to hear him say that immunity to COVID is probably lifelong. The virus had been around a year and a half at that time. Let's take a listen.
That's right. One of the biggest failures of our medical leadership has been ignoring natural immunity. It's about half of the unvaccinated, and they have a reasonable reason not to get the vaccine right now. They already have immunity. Many of them have circulating antibodies, and some of us doctors recommend one shot in those folks if they want to get a vaccine, but they've already got immunity. Now, there's two parts to immunity. One is the antibodies, but the other is the memory B cells and T cells, and that's probably what gives you decades of protection against severe illness. So COVID is going to turn into a seasonal virus that'll cause common cold-like symptoms, and that's going to be our future. We can't try to eliminate this with more restrictions.
And there are some people's cards that actually say that their shot expires within 6 months. I mean, are some of these shots good for a year or longer? Do we know? Do they tell us?
Immunity is probably lifelong. That's what many of us think. Certainly the test of natural immunity over 19 months is showing that it's going strong and it's durable. Vaccinated immunity, we have suggestions now from Israel that it may start to wane 6 months and 9 months into it. There's an early group now that's been shown to be more likely to get the infection but less likely to have any severe illness, and you're still protected against death.
All right, finally, the masks. Do we wear them? Don't we wear them? Should we wear them? Talk to us.
First of all, Judge, anyone who's concerned and wants to wear a mask, by all means, go ahead. My concern with mandates is not only are we going to be imposing mandates in areas with high population immunity based on a couple pockets with low vaccinated immunity, but also we're going to politicize the mask, and we can't be doing that. That does not help us.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I was confused there. He's saying immunity is lifelong, but then he's saying vaccinated immunity looks like it's beginning to wane. So is he talking natural immunity? Is he saying that is lifelong?
That's what he was saying in that clip. And there's many more examples of that. And when the Delta variant destroyed those declarations, he said things like this. He gave an interview to Nava Health. I forget exactly what they are. And he said, quote, and maybe he was speaking about just people with immunity at this point, but he said, for most people right now, Delta is downgraded to a mild seasonal illness that causes mild common cold-like symptoms. He also said this, if you're one of the 99% plus percent of kids that are unvaccinated, those kids don't need to worry. And the next month, we already said what the Delta variant did. It filled up hospitals for both children and adults alike.
It's while we're talking about how these people keep saying that children don't have to worry, children don't have to worry. I mean, Delta was pretty bad for kids, but by the numbers, Omicron was worse than Delta for kids. I think more children died of Omicron than of Delta. And so you had two variants at least that were coming that were going to be worse than the previous when it came to children. And these guys are just confidently saying that it's nothing to worry about. And they, to my knowledge, do not correct themselves ever.
No, you're exactly right about everything you just said. Omicron, because it was so much more contagious, was the worst variant for children. January 2022 was the worst month of the pandemic for children. Just under 200 children died. And in a single week, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, COVID hospitalized about 6,500 children in a single week. Right after Dr. Makary made that video and said children don't have to worry about getting vaccinated.
Yeah.
And Dr. Makary is probably most famous or infamous for this article that he published in the Wall Street Journal in February 2021, right after vaccines came out, titled, "We'll have herd immunity by April." And he followed this up with several articles saying herd immunity is near, despite Dr. Fauci's arrival. That was also in the Wall Street Journal. He published several articles in the the New York Post at the time, saying the risk of COVID is very low. I'll read here's exactly what they were. Risk of COVID is now very low. It's time to stop living in fear. And don't buy the fear mongering. COVID-19 threat is waning. So this guy who predicted herd immunity in April, well, here he is saying that he is right, that we had herd immunity in May 2021. And I'm not much of a tone police. I don't care how people really, I care what they say, not how they say it. But he's going to be mocking Dr. Fauci here. This just sort of shows the juvenile, childish way that a lot of these doctors behaved. And I'm not blameless, but I hope I never acted like this.
Which some people, I'm not going to say who, but some people have been doing, Dr. Walensky, by not talking about it. Let me know. Email me or let me know if you ever hear our nation's public health leaders talk about natural immunity. It's half of the population, and it's half of the unvaccinated population, which is why 80 to 85% of adults today have immunity. And we shouldn't be chasing after eradication.
Yeah, this is crazy. COVID zero. Like, I mean, people on their own, we can't get to COVID zero because New Zealand did it. So New Zealand had the good grace to be in the southern hemisphere, be geographically isolated, and able to shut down before they had significant community spread.
Yeah.
It was great for New Zealand.
We've been moving the goalposts so much. It's one of the reasons why people are not trusting public health officials. So we basically are at herd immunity right now. Right? Basically, we have 1/10 of the number of daily cases of a mild flu season. Mild flu season will have about 400,000 cases a day. We're at about 25,000 cases a day. We're below 1/10 the number of daily cases as the flu and the same case fatality rate. In the past, it wasn't. COVID was much more dangerous. Now it's the same because it's a younger people.
Marty is saying, right, is that now the cases are low enough that they're actually less than what you typically have in the flu season. Now everyone's like, but wait, the flu's less deadly on a case-per-case basis than COVID, except that that's not necessarily true anymore because case fatality, infection fatality rates, depending on what you're looking at, change based on, number one, how good you are treating it, number two, the vulnerability of the population that's getting infected. And now, because we've vaccinated most of our elders or they already had COVID, we have now shifted to younger people getting infected. So even when you see cases that are less likely to die, which means the infection fatality and case fatality rate drop. Does that make sense? So that's the in-depth, and just get my finger off the button for a second.
And that case fatality rate's 1.3 per 10,000 with flu. Yeah. And with COVID, it was 1.1 to 1.4 per 10,000.
That's crazy. That's crazy to be saying that right before Delta hits.
Correct. And let me just read the first sentence of his article from September 15th, 2021. This was in the Washington Post. The article was this: natural immunity to COVID is powerful. Policymakers seem afraid to say so. It begins by saying, it's okay to have an incorrect scientific hypothesis, but when new data proves it wrong, you have to adapt. And there's no better example of a failure to adapt to new data than Dr. Makary. We already discussed what he said when the Delta variant came around, but now we can listen to what he said when the Omicron variant came around. Shocking stuff.
Yeah, so I assume he's going to say pretty much the same thing here about.
Well, that's all he did. That's all he did. You know, there's a 0% chance that he's going to say, you know what? I said that we had herd immunity. I was wrong about that. I apologize. There's a 0% chance of him saying that, even as he begs other people to do the same thing, people who turned out to be right about us not having herd immunity. He's asking them to admit it.
Yeah, you know, when it comes to who we want to be our leaders in public health, ideally you want people who are going to go by the data, communicate uncertainty, and not overstep what the data is really showing. And that I understand that's a big ask, because the people who we did have in power in public health during the pandemic didn't always do that. And it would be, again, a hard ask or a tall ask to expect them to do that 100% of the time. There were, of course, learning processes that we all went through when it came to COVID. There were things that our public health officials did get wrong. But if you look at the pattern, like, again, going back to the example of vaccines and transmission, Dr. Fauci did not continue saying that COVID vaccines are going to stop transmission. You might be able to find him saying that once or twice when they actually were really good at preventing transmission, but he did not keep saying that. And he changed his messaging based on what the data were showing. And Makary and Bhattacharya, they don't seem to be doing that. They don't seem to be changing their message based on the data. They seem to just keep saying the same thing no matter what is happening around them, no matter how many times their predictions get proven wrong. And that's worrying to me, to have in a public health leader, somebody who constantly oversteps the data and constantly is not checking themselves and correcting themselves based on what the data are saying.
Right. Let me just read two quotes from Dr. Makary about vaccines in the spring of 2021. He said, quote, "Immunity kicks in fully about 4 weeks after the first vaccine dose, and then you are essentially bulletproof." He also said, "There has never been a documented case of a fully vaccinated person who is asymptomatic transmitting the virus." And you brought up Dr. Fauci, who stopped saying those things, which is fine. And these guys have also stopped saying those things. They would no longer say the vaccines rendered you bulletproof or stopped transmission, but they would do two things. They would never admit that they were the ones who helped spread the myth. They would only blame Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky. They said this was the biggest lie of the pandemic. These guys spread misinformation without acknowledging that it came from their own mouths. Mm-hmm. And again, we can hear what Dr. Makary had to say here about the Omicron variant.
Yep.
I call it the Omicold because now we have laboratory data that it's not infecting the deep respiratory system. It's staying in the upper respiratory system. We have epidemiological data that it's not driving hospitalizations. We see massive surges in parts of the world with no real change in death rates. By the way, we normally see a surge in respiratory pathogens in the winter. That's normal, but we're just not seeing it translate into the sort of severe illness. And the good news is it's replacing Delta. That's good. Now, I don't want anyone to get sick ever, but Omicron is good news. It is nature's vaccine for those who will never have access to a vaccine. It's displacing a far more dangerous variant, and it gives cross immunity to that more dangerous variant.
Okay, so as someone who followed the virology of this virus throughout the pandemic, I have to say that this idea that Omicron is such a more mild and variant and that it's nature's vaccine is ridiculous, and it's been disproven. We have data to say that Omicron's intrinsic virulence, its intrinsic ability to cause disease, was not much different from Delta or previous variants. We know this because there were countries or parts of the world that had limited exposure to COVID throughout most of the pandemic. Hong Kong is where this specific study that I'm thinking of was done. Hong Kong had very little COVID exposure throughout most of the pandemic. And then their vaccine program was not very successful. It did not reach a significant portion of their elderly population. So when those COVID restrictions lifted and Omicron came into Hong Kong, a lot of people died because a lot of people had not seen the virus before. When Omicron came around to the rest of the world, so many people had already either been vaccinated or been exposed to the virus previously, which is going to give them immunity against severe disease, some protection against severe disease. And so it was an apparent reduction in severity that we saw in Omicron. It looked like the virus was getting worse at causing severe disease, but really humans were just developing more immunity thanks to mostly vaccination and exposure to COVID. So it's not true that Omicron was nature's vaccine. It killed more kids than the other variants, and this is going to encourage people to not take precautions.
Yeah, and again, as we've discussed, another reason that it appeared more mild is by this point, 600 or so thousand Americans who were by definition vulnerable to the virus had already been taken off the table, since you can only die once. And even here in the United States, the Omicron variant caused severe disease. These are just two articles from the New York Times that were published shortly after Makary gave this interview. Headline number 1 read, "During the Omicron wave, death rates soared for older people," and "Hospitalizations of young children with the virus surged during the U.S. Omicron wave." And there's another video, I don't have it queued up for this, but of Dr. Makary, Z-Dog, and Vinay Prasad at this time actually this was December 2021, so right before the Omicron variant hit, just laughing at anyone who wanted, this was the first booster vaccine dose. They were just mocking people who wanted this vaccine dose, which, by the way, had proven itself in a randomized controlled trial. So they just thought it was the funniest thing to mock people who wanted this booster dose, which later, as I said, it already had proven itself in a randomized controlled trial, and it was shown to drastically limit COVID's worst outcomes in older people as well. So they just thought it was so funny to laugh at people who wanted that booster dose.
It's really disappointing from Z-Dog especially.
Absolutely.
All right, we got two more videos left.
And this is just another one of him declaring that the country was at herd immunity in May 2021. And just to show that this was not just in Z-Dog's podcast, that he was promoting this message that we were at herd immunity.
Okay, so we have multiple people now saying we are at herd immunity at multiple times in the pandemic.
Well, yeah, yes, correct.
All right.
That maybe we shouldn't buy into all this talk about the variants.
That's right. Look, we've had dozens of variants, and they're all entirely encompassed by the vaccine and preventing serious outcomes. So we got to be careful right now and not scare people. People need something to look forward to. And if you look at the numbers, we're doing really well right now, Trace.
Yeah, we are doing well. And what's your thing? I mean, you talked about this a couple of months ago. You said, look, we are 2 months away from herd immunity. Are we there? Are we getting closer? Is it ever going to be fully realized in your estimation?
Well, unfortunately, we have this perception now that's being created by some public health leaders that we need to reach total eradication. And we're not going to get to total absolute risk elimination. That's a false goal. And quite honestly, it's being used now to manipulate the public. We heard today again from our public health leaders that if we get to 70% vaccination, then we could start seeing restrictions move. That's dishonest. Most of the country is at herd immunity. Other parts will get there later this month. San Francisco had 12 cases yesterday, Trace, most asymptomatic. What do you call that? I call that herd immunity.
And then Delta hit.
And by the way, no public health leaders were talking about eradication.
Yeah, where's he getting that idea?
He's making it up in order to make himself look good. It's called a straw man argument.
Yeah.
It's a very dishonest and disingenuous form of argumentation. But notice he said that these public health leaders were trying to manipulate the public. Who is the person who's trying to manipulate the public in this video?
It's Marty Makary.
Exactly right. It's really kind of shocking stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, public health officials during COVID were not perfect, but this is just a clear pattern of disingenuous overstepping the data and not correcting yourself. And I don't want a public health leader who's going to constantly do those things.
Yeah, he's never, to my knowledge, admitted error or even acknowledged that these videos exist. It's as if they are just wiped off the face of the earth, just totally erased.
All right, we got one more video.
And maybe I should just give a little bit of introduction before we hear what Dr. Makary is going to say here. He is going to be normalizing RFK Jr. He is going to be saying that RFK Jr. shares true stories of children who died after getting the COVID vaccine, perfectly healthy children. And if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I will read to you the truth. I'm going to read a segment of an article titled, RFK Jr. spent years stoking fear and mistrust of vaccines. These people were hurt by his work. When 12-year-old Brandon Fahey collapsed during football practice and died, it was just the beginning of his parents' nightmare. Deep in their grief, a few months later, Gina and Patrick Fahey received news that shocked them to their core. A favorite photo of their beloved son was plastered on the cover of a book that falsely argues COVID-19 vaccines caused a spike of sudden deaths among healthy young people. This book, called Cause Unknown, was published by an anti-vaccine group led by Robert Kennedy Jr. Kennedy wrote the foreword and promoted the book, tweeting that it details data showing, quote, COVID shots are a crime against humanity. The Fays couldn't understand how Braden's face appeared on the book's cover or why his name appeared inside it. Braden never received the vaccine. His death in August 2022 was due to a malformed blood vessel in his brain. No one ever contacted them to ask about their son's death or for permission to use the photo. No one asked to confirm the date of his death, which the book misstated by a year. When the Fahey's and residents of their town in California tried to contact the publisher and author to get Braden and his picture taken out of the book, no one responded. We reached out in every way possible, Gina Fahey told the Associated Press in an emotional interview. We waited months and months to hear back, and nothing. And what does Dr. Makary have to say about incidents like this?
Well, one thing RFK Jr. did is he would post true stories of children who died immediately after the vaccine. These were otherwise healthy children. Social media didn't like that. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, anyone who even associated with him was censored. And in his hearing yesterday, what I really appreciated, Brian, is when he talked about the so-called toxic polarization of society and how we need to be kind to one another and restore civility. That is a message people are hungry for in the medical community, and I think at large.
I mean, that's just gross. I covered this story recently about the Fahey's, and it's one of many false stories that RFK Jr. has pushed over the COVID pandemic and over the years as an anti-vaccine advocate. And yeah, don't normalize RFK Jr. He's not sane. His ideas are either terrible and unscientific, or they're not new, right? Like if he's saying, oh, there's corruption in the FDA, there's corruption in the CDC. Okay, fine, give us examples of it and let's get rid of it. But he doesn't really do that. He doesn't ever give examples. He just says that, FDA is funded by Big Pharma, which is a misrepresentation of the truth. If we want to fund FDA through taxpayer dollars, fine, let's do it. But right now it's being paid out of pocket by pharma, and pharma does not like that. Anyway, the point is, if you want food to be healthier, if you want Americans to generally be healthier, you can't have someone who denies science like RFK Jr. At the helm, and people like Marty Makary saying that he's got good ideas or trying to defend him. That's just it tells me that they are just wanting a place in the administration, and they're kind of bowing down to who they think is going to be in power.
Yeah, and Dr. Makary has more corporate ties than just about any doctor that I know.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just read from one news report. Makary is a director on the board at Harrow, an ophthalmologic pharmaceuticals company, and an advisor to Sidecar Health, an insurance provider that aims to lower customer costs by eliminating provider networks and drug formularies. He is also a chief medical advisor to Nava, a benefits brokerage, and chief medical officer at Sesame, a cash pay health service market that offers compound semaglutide. So what are my pharma connections? I don't know. Once a year, they drop off donuts to my office and I kind of eat them. Shame on me. But in that clip that you played, I mean, it's just hard to imagine anything more disgusting than Robert Kennedy Jr., and you did your episode on this, exploiting these poor grieving parents, and then to have the surgeon from Johns Hopkins go on Fox News and say this is 100% true, and you wonder how many parents decided not to vaccinate their child against COVID or measles or polio, believing that their child might drop dead afterwards, and did all those children turn out okay? It's just shameful stuff.
Yeah.
And you talked about correctly how we need public health leaders who we can trust, who are going to be honest. And I think we've demonstrated today that these two characters are not going to do that. And I would just like to pause and have a moment of grief for the fact that none of these videos will matter. It doesn't matter. We are in normal times, in a normal world, any one of these videos, I think, would be disqualifying. That saying the pandemic ended in May 2021, or that a 1 in 500 risk of death is very moderate. that would be so problematic by itself. And we're just scratching the surface of these doctors' misinformation. One could write a whole book, a thick book on this topic. And so we're just giving you a small window into this, but none of this will matter. These guys are going to get confirmed, and they're going to say that they were right about everything, and their pandemic vision has been vindicated. And we should just mourn what we've lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sad. It's sad that the ones who want to rewrite history are going to be public health leaders. But we should try our best to not let them rewrite history and not let people forget what actually happened, what these people actually said, and how things actually turned out. And unfortunately, we might have to experience that the hard way, because we don't know when the next pandemic will come, but, bird flu is not looking great. We talked earlier about not betting on viruses, and I certainly would not bet on bird flu and when it might become a pandemic virus, but it has potential to, and that is really scary. It has more potential to now than it ever has. It's spreading in a lot of wildlife, mammals. It's spreading through our livestock. People are getting exposed. People are getting infected. It really is just a matter of time until we're dealing with another COVID situation in modern times. And I am mourning the idea of what will happen if that were to occur under the watch of these people, because it will not be good.
I couldn't agree more. And like I said, these guys are now the medical establishment, and it's our job to hold them accountable and make sure that they are responsible.
Yep. Thanks for joining me today, Jonathan. Thanks for joining me today, Jonathan. So where can people learn more about you and your work?
I would just recommend going to Science-Based Medicine. I do a blog there every week, more or less, where I've been holding these folks accountable, and I will continue to do so. And thanks for having me. I appreciate your good work.
Of course. All right, we'll see what the future holds.
All right, take care. Thanks.